Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Gnozim Auction House. Check out their new, beautiful catalog for Gnozim Auction 20, which will take place Sunday, February 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. As always with Gnozim, this auction has many amazing items, including a handwritten letter of the Baal HaTanya, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the first Slabodka Rebbe, a sefer with handwritten marginal notes in the Ramah Mifano's own hand, a fascinating letter from the Chofetz Chaim to his wife. And this letter is really fascinating. It's worth looking at, even for those that it's above your budget. The letter was written by the Chofetz Chaim in Yiddish to his wife during her journey to seek medical care, and he tells her that she should eat meat or chicken regardless of the cost. She should rent a comfortable apartment. And again, I'll put a link to this one specifically in the show's notes also. To well worth reading the letter. There's also Rav Chaim Kanievsky's personal siddur, and as it pertains to this episode, there is a fascinating collection of letters sent to Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld after the 1929 Chevron riots, which is the subject of this podcast episode. So again, you can check it out, Gnozim. That's GENAZYM.com, and I'll also put a link in the show's notes where you can check out the catalog. And if you're interested in, you can bid. You can already bid now. You can check out the catalog, so check it out. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email svarimchat@gmail.com or check out the information in the show's notes. You can also find a link in the show's notes to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and so on. Finally, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and with that, enjoy this episode. Quite a moving episode, I think, and the book as well. And there'll be a link in the show's notes to purchase the book, and you can read more about the 1929 Chevron riots. But with that, here's the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Yardena Schwartz, who is an award-winning journalist and the author of the recently published book, Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 Massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is referring to the Chevron riots, which many listeners probably are familiar, and you'll hear more about here in this episode. So thank you, Yardena, for joining me.
Thank you, Nachi, for having me.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I grew up in New Jersey. I was born and raised in Parsippany and went to the University of Delaware and then Columbia Journalism School, worked in TV news for about 5 years, and then I decided to quit my job at MSNBC, moved to Israel to become a freelance journalist, and I was based in Israel from 2013 to 2023. I moved back to the States to be closer to my family just 3 months before October 7th. I moved with my husband and our 2 kids to upstate New York.
Wow. And well, October 7th is something that'll come up. It's discussed in the book. I imagine you added that all the way at the end. Your book probably was basically ready to go. And we'll get into that later. That's something that comes up at the end of the book. It's not the focus of the book, but the book does cover post-1929. So we'll get there. So how did you become interested? I mean, you were in Israel for 10 years, so clearly you had some sort of interest. I mean, you could talk about in general about Israeli history, especially, the history of the conflict and things like that comes up. But how did you become interested specifically in the 1929 riots in Chevron?
So I had actually known very little about the history of Chevron or the Hebron massacre specifically until I started working on this book. I had been living in Israel for 6 years at that point. I'd been reporting for dozens of publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, Time Magazine, you name it. I probably wrote for them. And I was introduced to a family in Memphis, Tennessee by an amazing journalist who is now my mentor and was actually kind of the guardian angel of this book. His name is Yossi Klein Halevi, renowned author and journalist himself. He had met this family in Memphis who had discovered this treasure trove of letters in their attic. And those letters were written by their late uncle, David Shainberg, who was a yeshiva bacher in 1928 through 1929 at the Chevron Yeshiva. He was originally from Memphis, and during his year at the yeshiva, he wrote these beautiful, vivid, lengthy letters to his family describing what life was like in Chevron. But his life was cut short by that massacre on August 24th, 1929. And this family and their story, and David and his story were just incredible. And Yossi introduced me to the family. I read the letters, and I went to Hebron to learn more and to kind of piece together the life of this young man, and in the process piece together the story of what Hebron was before the massacre and what it ceased to be after the massacre, and how that massacre really transformed not just Chevron, but the old Yeshuv and the new Yeshuv and the Zionist movement as well. David, in his letters, so many aspects of his letters really fascinated me, but one of the most interesting aspects of them, which shocked me reading them in the beginning, was the fact that he was very opposed to the Zionist movement. He described it in one of his first letters to his family as a vile anti-Jewish movement. And this was a young man who was leaving his very comfortable life in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was expected to carry on his father's legacy in his very successful retail business. He quit his school at Wharton to go study Torah. He decided that studying Torah in New York was not for him and that he wanted to go do it in Eretz Yisrael. So to read that he was against Zionism really shocked me. And then, of course, I learned about, the anti-Zionism of the 1920s among, very traditional Jews, not just in the U.S., but also in what was then Palestine. And in fact, many of the Jews in Hebron were not, if not all of the Jews in Hebron were not Zionists at all. And that was true for many of the native Jews of Palestine before the massacre. And that, of course, changed after the massacre.
Yeah, so a lot to unpack and to go further in, because, you mentioned David Shainberg, and it's very interesting. Reading the book, I thought that was quite interesting, how you zoomed in and you chose to view the massacre and view the story through the lens, through the eyes of, Yeshiva Bacher that went to, you said, Chevron Yeshiva, which is Slabodka Yeshiva, that moved from Slabodka and now moved since to Yerushalayim. But that was a really very interesting decision. And so, like you said, you introduced to his letters, to his family, still, family that members now. So why did you decide, though, to frame the book in that way? And the book is not framed solely through his eyes. It's interesting how you frame it somewhat, and then you zoom in and you zoom out, I'll say, throughout the book of what you're discussing. You come back to it at the end and, discussing going there with his, I don't know, it's his niece or great niece, whoever. I'm forgetting exactly what it is that you end up with. So why did you decide to approach the book that way?
Well, his letters were really beautiful, and the way he saw Hebron and the land of Israel was really just breathtaking. And he really, his letters really brought these scenes and this place to life and its people to life. So it was very obvious to me from the moment I read these letters that it had to be through his eyes. Also, as a journalist, for all my years covering Israel for all kinds of publications, I always gravitated towards the human aspect of every story. Pretty much always told my stories through a character, through a person that was experiencing whatever hardship or issue I was writing about. My stories were usually character driven, real life, real people. And so I just think that that's always the most kind of interesting and most relatable way to understand history or to understand reality is through someone's eyes and through someone's experience. And his experience was just incredible.
So let's do that here a little bit in the beginning. The same way you open the book, before we really dive into the history, the lead up to the riots themselves, the story of the riots, and then post-riots. Kind of, the same way you follow in the book. I think that makes sense. So David Shainberg, as you mentioned, he's from Memphis. He grows up kind of traditional home. I don't think, you correct me if I'm wrong, he's really religious. He ends up becoming a Baal Tshuva of sorts. He goes to yeshiva. Like you said, he dropped out of Wharton. He left his family. His father was a successful businessman. He ends up in New York, and then he moves. He goes to Eretz Yisrael. He goes to Slabodka Yeshiva. I don't think there's many Americans there, and he's an American born and bred, a southern accent from Memphis, and he ends up in Slabodka Yeshiva in Chevron. What else can you tell us about him? How did he end up in Chevron? If you want to say some more about David than what you said before, and then before up until the riots.
So David was from what was a very traditional Jewish family in Memphis, Tennessee. So most of the Jews living in Memphis then were either European immigrants or the children or grandchildren of European immigrants. So both of his parents had come from Ukraine in the late 1800s. They owned a retail store in Memphis, and the family lived upstairs. And eventually his father, who had arrived penniless from Ukraine, built this one store into this retail chain across the South. And David was seen as kind of he was the firstborn son. He was this star salesman in the family when he was a little boy. He was very handsome, very charming. It was expected that he would carry on his father's legacy and take over the business. And around the age of 15, he became much more religious. His family was not very religious. They kept kosher. They went to shul, but they worked on Shabbat, like most of the Jews in Memphis who owned shops. They were open on Shabbat because that's when the goyim went shopping, and so they needed to stay open on Shabbat to make a living. But David, once he became more religious, he made his father close the shop on Shabbat. He eventually, he went to war and dropped out to study under the local Orthodox Rabbi Baccarat, who was a very interesting character himself, this French Chassid who became the rabbi in Memphis. And then Rabbi Baccarat really recognized his skill in learning. Like, he was learning so quickly, and he felt like he had a future as potentially a great rabbi, and he felt that, Memphis was not the place for him. He should go to New York and study at a yeshiva there. So he moved to New York, lived in Brooklyn in Borough Park, and became friendly with Rabbi Zev Gold of the World Mizrahi movement, but later the World Mizrahi movement, but, he founded the Torah Vodas yeshiva, and that's where David started to study. He also studied a little bit at the riots, Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. And he really loved learning Torah, but felt like New York was also not the right environment. He was like going to the theater, and he was very popular with the ladies, and just felt like all of these were, unnecessary distractions. He really wanted to live like a monk. Like, he envisioned himself going to the land of Israel, studying in a place where all he would do is study and be surrounded by, this biblical landscape of the Torah and the stories where the place where its stories had unfolded. And that was what led him to the land of Israel. And the ticket to get to Palestine then cost what would now be worth around $4,000. It took him 2 weeks by land and sea. He took a boat from New York Harbor to France, and then a train to Italy. And he ended up taking another boat from Egypt to Palestine, to Jaffa. And that ticket, because his parents opposed his move to the land of Israel, they didn't support him going there. Young Jewish men did not go to the land of Israel in 1928 to study Torah. That wasn't something you did back then. And so, because his parents didn't support his move, his ticket was actually paid for by Rabbi Gold. And when he got to his first stop was Tel Aviv, and he spent a few days there, and then he went to Yerushalayim, and then finally arrived in Chevron. And he was one of when he arrived, there were about 10 other American yeshiva students. By the time the massacre took place, there were about 20. And when the massacre unfolded, 25 of the victims were Slabodka yeshiva students, including 8 Americans.
Yeah, and that's obviously terrible. By the way, disclaimer, I read this book on Shabbos. You probably shouldn't. It gets really sad when you get up to the massacre, unfortunately, of course. So, and there's other parts about David that I found very moving as well. You talk about, I'm going to jump around here for a little, but after he was killed, they had found out that there was like this gemach that people would just be lending money, and then it dried up, and it was really David behind the scenes. He was taking money, lending money quietly. Nobody knew who it was. Any of the Bachrim needed money, he would lend out money. And as you say, and you really pull from his letters throughout the book, where his beautiful descriptions of Eretz Yisrael, of Chevron, as he's writing back to his family, which is really beautiful to read, and you can kind of see through those letters what he was feeling when he was there, when he was learning in Slabodka Yeshiva. So let's just talk a little bit also about the Slabodka Yeshiva in general. Obviously, we'll come back to David before we get to the scene that's going on in Palestine. Slabodka Yeshiva was in Europe, and it ends up moving to Chevron. When does it move? How does it get from Slabodka to Chevron, of all places? Because Chevron was a very large Arab population, but there was not that big of a Jewish, even though there was a Jewish community there for a while, the Jewish community wasn't massive.
So there had always been a Jewish community in Chevron throughout all of the exiles and thousands of years. There had been this very small but very devoted Jewish community that lived in the area around Marat HaMachpelah. But yes, under Muslim rule for nearly 1,000 years, Jews were prohibited from entering Marat HaMachpelah. Under 700 years of this Muslim rule that prohibited non-Muslims from entering, Jews could only get as close as the seventh step, and they would have to say their prayers through a hole in the wall. It was this humiliating experience, and nevertheless, they did it because that was why they lived in Chevron. And when the reason Slabodka Yeshiva relocated to Chevron in 1925 was because the Lithuanian government issued draft orders that would have required yeshiva students to serve in the Lithuanian military. And at the time, European yeshivot were still based in Europe alone. They were not moving to Eretz Yisrael. But when Slabodka relocated to Chevron, it became the first Lithuanian yeshiva and Eastern European yeshiva to move to Eretz Yisrael. And the reason they chose Chevron, first of all, it wasn't an obvious choice. It wasn't their first choice. They were deciding between Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Rehovot, a slew of other towns. But Chevron was one of Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Epstein's favorite choices because of its, serenity and its holiness as, being the burial place of Abraham and the rest of the, patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. But they worried about the fact that it was, this mostly Arab town. It was in 1929, there were 20,000 Muslims living in Chevron and just 800 Jews. Mind you, by the way, today, Chevron is home to more than 250,000 Arabs and just 800 Jews. So at the time, it was, a much smaller ratio than it is today. But nevertheless, it seemed like maybe it wouldn't be safe. But when they came to Chevron to see if it would be a good place to base the yeshiva, the leaders of the Ashkenazi community, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Slonim, who was the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Chevron, and his son Eliezer Dan Slonim, who were Chabad dynasty, Chabad royalty, descendants of Rebbetzin Menucha Rachel Slonim, who had established the Ashkenazi community in Hebron. They convinced the leaders of Slabodka that Chevron was actually the safest place for Jews in Palestine, because in previous rounds of violence where Jewish communities in other parts of Palestine had been attacked, the riots, which were on a much smaller scale than the riots of 1929, but those riots didn't affect the Jews in Hebron because there were such great relations between the city's Jewish minority and its Arab majority. And also they convinced the yeshiva that the Jewish community was in danger of disappearing because it had been greatly reduced by World War I. Many of the Jews in Hebron had left Hebron during World War I, either for, left Palestine altogether, or they moved to Jerusalem. And so they argued that, the Hebron Jewish community really needed the yeshiva to kind of revitalize the Jewish community, and it really did. It led more Jews to move to Hebron. It actually improved the relations between the Jewish community and the Arab community, because the Arab community, many of the yeshiva students rented homes from Arab landlords. So they really contributed to the economy. There were all these yeshiva students, frequenting Arab businesses in Chevron, like the markets and the shops. So yeah, that's how Slabodka Yeshiva came to move to Chevron.
Okay, so and obviously we'll hear more about Chevron shortly when we get to the riots. But so Chevron is this place, as you said. I think the number is 20,800. You can kind of see the disparity there between the Arabs and the Jews, and they did have reason to fret, and unfortunately they were convinced that it's safe, and the Slonims played a role in this, and we'll get to the Sun. We'll get back to that once the riots occurred. But let's now take a step back and talk about the situation in British Mandate Palestine at the time. So the riots take place in 1929, but I guess you should step back a little bit, just predating that. What's going on in general in Palestine? Because that's important to understand the picture of what happens in 1929 in Hebron.
Of course. So what happened in Hebron did not only happen in Hebron. The riots that swept through Palestine reached every Jewish community. They began in Jerusalem on August 23rd, 1929, the day before the massacre in Hebron. And the lead up to the riots had actually been building up for a whole year, going back to 1928, Yom Kippur of 1928, when Jewish worshippers on Yom Kippur brought a divider to the Kotel, as they had done it during many high holiday services. But this time when they did it, they were met by opposition from the Muslim leaders, most importantly, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amina Husseini, who was essentially the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule. He had been appointed by the British, and he had waged this campaign of disinformation, claiming that the Jews of Palestine were plotting to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque, to destroy it, and rebuild their ancient temple, to rebuild the Third Temple. And he had started spreading that rumor around Yom Kippur of 1928, which was just around the time that David arrived. And this was against the backdrop of rising Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, where pogroms were raging. It was also against the backdrop of the British supposed or alleged support of the Zionist movement. I mean, you can say that the British supported Zionists and the Zionist movement because they built the Balfour Declaration into the mandate to rule Palestine. But you can also argue that throughout their mandate, they did so much to undermine that promise of building a Jewish home. I mean, when the British conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire after World War I, they did end these strict limits on Jewish immigration that had existed under Turkish rule. And they allowed for, at first, unlimited Jewish immigration to Palestine. But over time, they continued to vastly limit Jewish immigration and land purchases as a direct result of the opposition from Arab leaders like the Grand Mufti, who they had appointed to his post. And throughout his campaign of disinformation and lies spread against the Jewish community and his efforts to restrict Jewish access to the Kotel, under the guise that the Kotel was actually a Muslim holy site, which of course it wasn't. Muslims who lived around it would throw their garbage there. They would allow their donkeys to walk there and relieve themselves near the Kotel. So, I mean, it was really, ludicrous for him to claim that it was a Muslim holy site. But the British didn't try to stop this campaign of disinformation. They didn't counter it. They did virtually nothing to protect Jews praying at the Western Wall from increasing Muslim attacks at the Western Wall as a direct result of the Mufti's propaganda campaign. So it wasn't just the Mufti's incitement that led to the massacre, but it was also the British neglect of its Jewish subjects, who they were in charge of protecting and absolutely failed to protect.
Yeah, and that's something that you really hit on in the book. You talk about the Mufti in depth. You talk about his biography, and we can discuss him more if whatever you think is relevant. I mean, you discuss him quite in depth for those that are interested in reading the book, and you talk about, like you said, the British is in action, and kind of they're always like putting their hands up, like everybody don't fight, and that's what they tried to do, which unfortunately really led to what happened a lot of it. They played a role in it, certainly. And I think you also highlight what you just said, that, of course, the Kaisel was not a Arab site. And you mentioned, I believe, that at one point they had put out a brochure saying, Jews should come, trying to get like tourism, like the Arabs were trying. And then they suddenly changed their tune. Like, no, suddenly it's this Arab site. They realized, oh, what are we doing? So amidst all this and the rising tension, the Mufti decides basically, spreading really ramps up the disinformation campaign and the fake news. And he really goes into the Jews are going to take over. The Jews are taking it over. They're blacking the Arabs off. They're going to take, and then always it comes back to this. I mean, till today, right? They're going to take the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa, and this is what happens. And suddenly this kind of disinformation is being spread everywhere. Is that kind of, I guess, the proper way to put it? And then is this kind of what happened? And then all of a sudden, before you know it, the rioting starts. Now, did he tell them to riot, or what happened there?
So there was one event that really sparked the violence. It had been building since Yom Kippur of 1928, but on Tisha B'Av of 1929, so mid-August of 1929, when 10,000 Jews went to pray at the Kotel, as they had every year, they were surrounded by this line of British police officers who were there to protect them from Muslim attacks. The following day, hundreds of Jews marched to the Kotel in protest of the British failure to do anything to stop this disinformation, to protect Jewish worshipers. And they chanted, the wall is ours. They called for the redemption of the Kotel, and they sang Hatikva, which would later become Israel's national anthem. They waved the Magen David flag, which would later become the Israeli flag. And what that did was it gave the Mufti all the ammunition he needed to say to his Arab and his Muslim following that, see, look, I was right. They want to take over the Kotel, and from the Kotel, they'll take over Al-Aqsa, and they'll build their ancient temple. And if we don't do anything to stop it, they'll take over the whole country. And he didn't have to pull any strings. He didn't have to tell anyone, go kill Jews. All he had to say was, we need you to defend Islam and, rise up and stand up against this effort to destroy Al-Aqsa. And with those words, all of the imams who he oversaw, he wasn't just the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, which is essentially the Muslim equivalent of the chief rabbi of Palestine. He was also the head of the Supreme Muslim Council, which the British had also created as a body to oversee all of the Sharia courts, all of the Muslim holy sites. And so he oversaw all of the imams, all of the clerics, and clerics who he had installed. There was no evidence tying him, directly to telling them what to say, but it was enough for him to say that the Jews are planning to destroy Al-Aqsa, for the imams to then give their sermons calling on Muslims to defend Islam and Al-Aqsa with their blood, which is what they did on August 23rd, 1929. And after those sermons at Al-Aqsa, thousands of Muslim worshippers left Al-Aqsa, descended down to the Kotel, down to the Old City, and proceeded to assault Jewish passersby, set fire to Jewish businesses, and the riots had begun. And they engulfed all of Palestine, reaching every Jewish community. Jewish communities in Gaza and throughout the north and the south were evacuated by British forces. And yet the Jews of Hebron paid the heaviest price during this week of riots. The riots killed 133 Jews throughout Palestine and wounded more than 400 others. 6 out of those 133, 67 were killed in Chevron. And it wasn't just that the Jews of Hebron suffered the highest number of casualties. They also suffered the most horrific brutality that was hauntingly similar to the brutality we saw on October 7th. So babies were slaughtered in their mother's arms. Children were forced to watch as their parents were butchered by their neighbors. Women, teenage girls were raped before they were killed. Rabbis and yeshiva students were castrated. Houses were burnt. It was just a level of carnage and cruelty that had not been seen in centuries in the Holy Land. And the British were completely unprepared despite all the warning signs. And actually, the Jews of Hebron had also ignored the warning signs. Well, at least the Jewish leaders of Hebron had ignored the warning signs. And they just had so much faith in their relations with their Arab neighbors and their Arab friends. And when the Haganah got wind that riots were going to break out, they actually visited Hebron 2 days before the riots erupted. They visited Chevron and offered to either bring reinforcements and weapons or to evacuate the Jews from Chevron to Jerusalem until the riots died down. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their opposition. They said, no, you need to leave. Your presence here will only be provocative. And, seeing armed people here will only make the Arabs more suspicious. And we trust our Arab neighbors not to hurt us.
Yeah, really, first of all, unbearably sad, and we'll talk more now about the Chevron riots. But when I read that, it was like, you read it happening, and they're like, no, don't worry about it, go in. The whole buildup, and they came armed, and they were disguised, and they still caught wind. They sent them out. So only Eliezer Dan Slanim is the only one with a gun, I think, and the British just around the country are woefully unprepared, undermanned, and you had this like one British police officer. He's the head Kafarada in Chevron, and suffice to say, I'm sure you'll talk about him. He does not do a very good job. Your book does not paint him in a flattering light, and everyone else is just Arab policemen under him, and they really don't do anything throughout the riots. And let's talk about the Chevron riot specifically. So, as we mentioned before, the Slabodka Yeshiva is there. David Shainberg is there, and so, like you mentioned, they rent houses throughout the community. Some with Jews, some even rent with Arabs, from Arabs, and so what happens? How do the riots begin in Chevron? As you said, it spread out from Yerushalayim, but how does it start in Chevron? And you really vividly describe it in the book, how they end up barricaded in homes together. And I'll let you explain here on the podcast. Again, unbearably sad.
So the riots, when they broke out in Jerusalem, they actually ended up reaching Chevron that same day. But the massacre only took place the following day. The day the riots began in Chevron on August 23rd, they actually first hit the yeshiva. And it was just before Shabbat had begun. There were no yeshiva students there at the time. They had all gone home either to get ready for Shabbat or because they had sensed that tensions were growing and it wasn't safe to be in the streets because Arab rioters had started to throw stones at Jewish homes. Already families were locking their doors and windows and, hiding inside their homes. But there was one yeshiva student who was blissfully unaware of what was going on. He was already dressed in his white Shabbat clothes. He went to the yeshiva to pray and to read, and he was caught completely unaware by a mob who caught him at the entrance. First, they threw rocks at him, and he tried to flee, but he ran directly into this crowd of rioters who stabbed him to death at the entrance to the yeshiva. And what was really shocking to read was the testimony of the yeshiva's keeper, who had he had seen the mob coming just in time to hide in a cistern. But he spoke Arabic. He was Yemenite, and he understood what they were saying. And he also noticed that there was an Arab policeman nearby who did nothing. And that was one thing that dominated the testimony of victims who said not only did they see policemen standing by and doing nothing, but there were also Arab policemen who took part in the massacre and in the attacks on Jewish homes. And the British police chief, Raymond Kafarada, who had just been assigned to his post a few weeks before the riots erupted, he didn't really know the Jewish community. He barely knew the Arab leaders of Chevron. He had also been warned of the riots and just kind of said, it'll blow over. When Jewish leaders of Hebron asked him for help and asked him what they should do, he just said, stay in your homes and you'll be safe. And by the time he did call for reinforcements, it was too late, because all of the police throughout Palestine were overrun and understaffed. And the British Empire ended up having to call in troops and warplanes and warships from across the empire to quell the riots, because there was no, there were police force, but it was predominantly Arab throughout Palestine. And it wasn't just in Hebron where the Arab policemen took part in the riots. It was everywhere. And they didn't have a military. The British forces in Palestine were essentially non-existent before the massacre. It was the massacre that led the British to bring in, troops to address the situation. And in Hebron, it was only once the rioters turned their attention to the British policeman, Hafarada, that he ended up finally firing his gun into the air. Until then, he hadn't used his gun. And only once his own life was in danger, he decided to fire shots in the air, despite the fact that he had witnessed Jews being slaughtered in front of his eyes, including 2 young yeshiva students who were killed at the footsteps of his horse. He was mounted on a horse along with other policemen who were trying to, quiet the riots without using force. And it was only once those riots were directed at him that he used force. And they quickly dispersed. As soon as he fired his gun, the rioters dispersed and the massacre ended.
But unfortunately, that was too late for David Shainberg and a lot of others. And unfortunately, what happened, many of them gathered. Eliezer Dan Slanim, who was very familiar and he was on very good terms with the Arabs, so they gathered at his home, which proved to be a critical mistake. That's something, similar to, not similar, but what happened to some of the scenes that you mentioned earlier, those graphic scenes, is what happened in his house. Actually, I believe his child survived, right? And some of the survivors there survived with wounds for life. But if you want to talk about that, and David, just talk about David's demise, and David was elsewhere at the time, in his house, I believe.
Yeah, what happened to Eliezer Dan Sonim and his family was really one of the most tragic stories of the massacre, not only because both he, his wife, and their 5-year-old son were killed, and their 11-month-old barely survived. He was found barely breathing in his mother's arms with a wound in his head. But it was most tragic because his home was thought to be the safest place in Hebron. When the riots erupted, dozens of people went to his home to take shelter because they were sure that the rioters would do nothing to this man who was not just prominent in the Jewish community in Hebron, but also in the Arab community. He was the only Jew on Hebron City Council. He had many Arab friends. He spoke Arabic. He was born and raised in Hebron. His family had been there for several generations. And that morning, before the riots erupted, Arab friends came to his house and sat on his outside the door and said, we're going to be here to protect you. We'll make sure nothing will happen. And there were 70 people in his home. And when the mob came to his home, he was told, if you give up the foreigners among you, we'll spare your life. And he told them, there are no foreigners among us. We Jews are one people. And he was one of the first people to be killed. He was the only armed man in Chevron. He had the only gun, and he didn't even use it. He was killed before he could use it. And many yeshiva students, women, children were killed in his home in the most horrific ways. And David was killed along with his roommates and the rabbi who he had been renting his home from, Rabbi Betzalel Samrik, who had also moved there from Eastern Europe around the time that the yeshiva moved there. And his roommates were also Americans. And this same graphic scene, horrific scenes that played out in the home of Eliezer Dan Sonim played out in the home of Rabbi Samrik and so many other homes. But an interesting kind of illustration of the different sides of humanity that were witnessed that day, from, the most extreme cruelty to heroism was displayed in the treatment of Eliezer Dan Slonim and his father. So Eliezer was killed by Arabs, including his own friends, who entered his home and slaughtered dozens of people there. But his father was actually rescued by his Arab landlord, and that landlord saved not just Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Slonim, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron, but 30 people who were in his home, including his own children. And it was really just astounding, the story that took place there. His Arab landlord was actually in his vineyard when the riots erupted that morning, and his young son ran to the vineyard to get his father, and he literally arrived on a white horse and stood outside the house before the mobs and said, if you want to enter this house, you'll have to do so over my dead body. And he was stabbed by rioters, and he didn't back down. And he stood there, and he was over 70 years old, and he didn't give up. And even when the mob left and the rabbi's daughter, tried to bring this man inside to help him and help heal his wounds, he said, no, I'm going to stay here. I don't think this is over yet. And he was one of about 24 Arab families who rescued their Jewish neighbors. At least 250 Jews were saved that day, thanks to their heroic Arab neighbors who risked their own lives to save theirs.
Right. I remember reading that story in the book, a very poignant story as well. And it really was, that's really what, they thought. The yeshiva and Eliezer Dan Slonim, they thought that that's what they would, all their Arab neighbors would do for them. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And really a horrible scene in Eliezer's house and in some of, David Shainberg's house. And so what was it like? And this is something you describe again in really vivid detail, but a different kind of detail for David's family as they're sitting there with bated breath, trying to find out what happened to their loved one, what happened to David. You made the parallel to October 7th. There's another parallel that listeners can be familiar with. Everyone's sitting there on, there's no communication, there's no phones and WhatsApp and things like that and those social media. And they're trying to find out, they hear about the riots. And the thing is David part of it? Is David alive? And first they get news that he is okay and he's not okay. And there's a different name and it's misnamed in the papers and there's a confusion. And I mean, did you have no letters from David at the time? But how did you research, first of all, that and what exactly, how did they find out in the end?
So a lot of my research was done in archives in Israel, but also in newspaper archives. So I went into the archives of Tennessee and Memphis newspapers, and they went into great detail of the trauma and, the experience of David's family waiting to hear from their son. And so I followed that story by reading the newspaper articles each day from the time that the riots erupted. And they described how David's father was in New York at the time for business, and he cabled his family saying, I saw the news and there's no word yet from David. I sent a cable to Jerusalem, waiting to hear back. He said that he spoke to the U.S. consulate, and they were going to put out a list of Americans who were killed, and then I just kept following that story as it was reported in the papers. And at first, when they published that list of Americans that were killed, the way they named David was with a different name, so they named him David Shainberg, and the family at first was relieved, thinking, it's a different David, but David's mother knew there was no David Shainberg from Memphis, and she collapsed, and she wouldn't stand up for days, and his family was really forever changed by his death. His two brothers stopped believing in God. They had been also, traditional Jews, they weren't as religious as David, but they certainly believed in God, and they kept kosher and kept Shabbos and everything. They had stopped, working on Shabbat, but they no longer believed in God. They said, if something so horrific could happen to David of all people, this amazing, beautiful soul, then, how could there be a God? And nevertheless, they continued to be very Zionist, very Jewish in, the heritage sense of Jewish. So they ended up establishing the JCC of Memphis. They sent all their kids and grandkids to Israel, and they were very big parts of the Jewish community in Memphis, but they didn't believe in God for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's a sentiment that happened post-Holocaust to individuals as well. Something that, unfortunately, going through, family members, they themselves went through unspeakable horrors and something like this. And so, you talk a lot about after. So that's only about half the book, which is, and it's a pretty big book. I would say the book is around, 400 pages. But the latter half of the book, goes through what you claim in the subtitle, which I mentioned in the beginning, which is the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that's something I think we should get into, which is, moving past the story of the Chevron riots and massacre is something that you say it ignited the conflict until now. We're in 2024 and October 7th in 2023, there's still unfortunately ongoing. So why did you come to that? And so we'll also I'll just ask you that, but I do want to say before that the book, therefore, what it covers then is, you pick up subsequently what happened, the Mufti and Arafat and Hamas, and really what goes on since. And also Chevron importantly, and we'll get back to this shortly, Chevron's community subsequent, the Arab community, and then the Jewish community, Kiryat Arba, and then you have Chevron, and what happens there and what's continuing to happen there in Chevron until today. So, but why do you claim that in the subtitle? So that claim of the riots ignited the conflict.
The reason I came to the conclusion that the riots of 1929 ignited the conflict was because from that point on, the driving forces of this conflict have been defined by the forces that ignited those riots. So the forces of disinformation, particularly surrounding Al-Aqsa and the supposed Jewish plot to destroy it, that began with the riots of 1929, and it has set the formula for every Palestinian leader since. So the reason the Mufti began that campaign of disinformation and propaganda was because he had been accused of corruption, nepotism, misuse of funds that were meant for the Waqf. And we've seen how every corrupt Palestinian leader has managed to distract his people from his absolute failure to bring them a better life, to lift them out of perpetual poverty. And they have managed to do that, whether it was the Grand Mufti or Arafat or Hamas, by focusing on this plot to destroy Al-Aqsa or whatever other lie they can come up with. So, we've seen how many various lies have fueled violence over the years. Mostly it's around Al-Aqsa, but it's not only that. I mean, even just if you look at the aftermath of October 7th, there have been so many various blood libels that have fueled violence, not just in Israel, but around the world, out of seeking to take revenge on Jews for their supposed, evil. So whether it was the claim that Israel had bombed that hospital just 10 days after October 7th, which was clearly not Israel that struck this hospital. It was a misfired rocket launched by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That's just one example, but there have been so many. And also in 1929, it wasn't just the lie surrounding Al-Aqsa. It was also the lie that spread immediately after the riots began that Jews had in fact slaughtered Muslims in Jerusalem, when it was Muslims who had slaughtered Jews in Jerusalem. But one of the reasons the riots began in Chevron was because this rumor had arrived in Chevron that Arabs were being slaughtered in droves in Jerusalem by Jews. And so the Arabs in Chevron thought they were taking revenge. And to this day, that lie still is still at work. When I spoke to Palestinians in Hebron, they either didn't know about the massacre of 1929, or they claimed that it was perpetrated by the Jews or by the Arabs. If they recognized that there was a massacre, they said it was as a result of Jews killing Arabs in Jerusalem. So, I mean, the role of disinformation has perpetuated this conflict for the better part of the last century. And those forces began in 1929. And, before 1929, there had been tensions between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, but nothing on this level. I mean, this was the first mass casualty event of this conflict as we know it. There had been massacres perpetrated against Jews in Palestine throughout Muslim rule in Palestine, but it wasn't part of the current form of this conflict. It was under Ottoman rule or Egyptian rule. There were, different attacks on Jews in Palestine, but this was the first instance where the war, you could say, between Palestinian nationalism and Zionism really took its first, really had its first mass casualty event.
And so for those interested also in, subsequent Israeli history and the lead up to 48 and post 48 and really in the conflict's history, as I said, you go through the Mufti and Arafat and the founding of Hamas and all those different things. But of course, back to Chevron. So first of all, I thought you said they would think about the massacre. I thought they would talk about Baruch Goldstein and the massacre in 1994. And, that occurred in Chevron and just what's gone on in Chevron since. If you could talk about as you said, you say this in the book, you met with Arabs in Chevron. You went onto the Arab side and you also tried to give a sense for those that haven't been there. I mean, I've been there. I'm sure many listeners have been to Chevron, and you can kind of feel you go in your armored bus and you go to Massacre and you can see what Chevron is like today. You have Kiryat Arba and what kind of goes on there. And you kind of talked about how they resettled Chevron and the resettlement movement and all of that. So if you could talk a little bit, let's at least talk about, I'll leave the most of the subsequent history to the book for those interested and can read the book. But about Chevron, I think it's worth discussing, what's happened since in Chevron and the community kind of until today, the Arab and Jewish community of Chevron.
So before I started working on this book, I had been to Chevron just once. And like most journalists covering Israel and Palestinians and the conflict, I really thought of the settlers as, these violent extremists. And I knew nothing about their history in Chevron. And I was really shocked to learn that the Jewish community in Chevron was essentially established out of the ashes of the exiled Jewish community Chevron in 1929, when Moshe Levinger and his followers worked to settle Chevron and return this exiled Jewish community to its home. It was, in a sense, to revive this community that had been decimated. And so that was really interesting to learn, and also interesting that one of the things I learned from speaking to settlers in Chevron is that Rabbi Kahana, his ideology was formed by his lessons, the lesson that he learned from the Massacre of 1929. So his idea that there can be no coexistence was actually what he concluded from the, betrayal of the Arabs in Chevron of their Jewish neighbors. And I also didn't know until spending so much time in Chevron with the Jews who live there is that many of them revere Baruch Goldstein as, this hero. When I went to Chevron that one time before I started working on this book, I had visited Baruch Goldstein's grave in Kiryat Arba, and I saw that there were, rocks placed on his tombstone out of respect and in mourning of this man. And so I knew that he had fans. I knew that, not everyone saw him as, a mass murderer, but I didn't know just how much support he had among the Jews living in Chevron. And that was really shocking to me. I met with Baruch Marzel many times during my reporting in Chevron, and he was kind of a right-hand man to Rav Kahana, and also a good friend of Baruch Goldstein's. And, people talk about how Itamar Ben-Gvir had this framed portrait of Baruch Goldstein in his home before he, entered mainstream politics. So Baruch Marzel still had that framed portrait of Baruch Goldstein when I went to interview him. And, yeah, the Jewish community in Hebron really sees itself as carrying on the legacy of those Jews who were violently exiled in 1929.
Yeah, I was going to say, what legacy, what impact does it have? What impact? Definitely the impact. But what legacy do the riots have in modern day Hebron, in the community there, on both sides?
It's a good question. So among the Jews in Hebron, the legacy of the riots is that, nothing will lead Jews to leave Hebron. That, Hebron is the cradle of the Jewish people. It is, the birthplace of Judaism, if you will, and a place that Jews have every right to live in. If, many of them say, if Jews have a right to live in Tel Aviv or Ramat Gan or Haifa, then how can Jews not live in Hebron, the place where Avraham and Sarah and, the forefathers and mothers of the Jewish people are buried? And so that is sort of the legacy that lives on in Hebron today, this idea and this will to remain steadfast in the face of terrorism. So, the Jews who live in Hebron, they don't feel unsafe. They don't feel in danger. They don't feel the kind of, lack of security that many Jews feel when they visit Hebron, going there in an armored bus, feeling, unsafe walking the streets. The Jews who live there don't feel that. They feel that, this is their home and this is where they have the right to live and where they will live. And on the other side of the checkpoint in Palestinian Hebron, so for those listeners who don't know, Hebron is a massive city. The Jewish side, the side controlled by Israel, is only 20% of Hebron. And, 800 Jews live there among about 35,000 Arabs. But on the Palestinian controlled side, 80% of Hebron, which is controlled by the Palestinian Authority, that side is home to about 250,000 Arabs. And, many people talk about how Arabs can't walk on this one street on the Israeli side of Hebron. Okay, Israelis can't enter 80% of Hebron. There are also streets on the Israeli side where Israelis cannot enter. And on the Palestinian side, when I spoke to many Palestinians, they believe that there is no Jewish connection to the land of Israel. They believe that the land of Israel is a lie made up by Zionists. They believe that all of the archaeological evidence to the contrary, archaeological evidence attesting to Israeli history and history of the land of Israel. And they call that Zionist propaganda. I heard that from the Arab mayor of Hebron, who told me that Abraham was not Jewish, he was Muslim, and that, just these ridiculous things that I had to kind of just listen to and nod my head and, okay. And this man who's now the mayor of Hebron, he's serving his second term. He was reelected. He actually carried out what was at the time the worst terrorist attack ever perpetrated in the West Bank in 1980. He killed 6 yeshiva students who had just emerged from Shabbos prayers at Marat Machpelah, and he has no remorse for that attack. He was actually released from prison in a prisoner swap just a few years after he was arrested. And he was elected to become the mayor of Hebron, was reelected in 2020. And he claims that Jews have no right to live in Hebron or the land of Israel. And this was something I heard from many Palestinians, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the book ends with, and really, by the way, for listeners, we really glossed over that here. We really focus on the Hebron part because really there's a lot, like I mentioned, really almost half the book, I would say, is on the subsequent history. And you can read all about Hamas, and you can read about, there's a lot there about, again, Arafat and all that history.
And the Mufti's role in the Holocaust and his role as
Yes.
a Nazi. I mean, I think before writing this book, I knew that the Mufti had been kind of aligned with the Nazis, but he was an actual Nazi. I mean, he lived in Berlin throughout World War II in a Nazi finance estate. He led the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. He was placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals at the end of World War II. And then he went on to train his cousin, Yasser Arafat, to take over his role as the leader of the Palestinian nationalist movement. So I think that was one of the most shocking elements of my research, just how horrible this man was and his tremendous impact on the Palestinian nationalist movement. I mean, this guy was the father of the Palestinian nationalist movement, and yet we hear so little about him. And I think that's because of his role during the Holocaust and his role as a Nazi, which I think is an inconvenient truth for many supporters of the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to make sure we at least mention some of the year. But the book ends with October 7th, and you really go into a treatment of October 7th, obviously until publication date for the book. So you can tell listeners when you stop, when the book stops, with obviously, still ongoing conversations about that, now. Why did you decide to include it?
So before October 7th, by the way, I began writing this book 4 years before October 7th. So this book was always going to be about the 1929 Chevron massacre, but it was going to focus more on the transformation of Chevron from then to now. And after October 7th became painfully clear that, the focus needed to be much bigger than that on the driving forces of this conflict that have fueled it since 1929 and the haunting parallels between these two massacres and what those echoes tell us about the nature of this conflict and how so much of the policy surrounding it has been misinformed because it has ignored the role of disinformation and propaganda and these corrupt leaders who seek to perpetuate the conflict for their own political gain. And so that was how I needed to reframe it after October 7th. And of course, to illuminate these chilling parallels between the two massacres, I had to, include and add new chapters about October 7th to show those parallels. So, you see in the chapters I wrote about both massacres, how similar the atrocities were, how similar the causes and the aftermath. So in 1929, just like on October 7th, Arab leaders denied the atrocities and also blamed them on their Jewish victims. And, so I illuminate that in the chapters after October 7th. And sadly, the chapters that I wrote about October 7th and its aftermath are still relevant today because we see that same pattern of blaming everything on Jewish victims or on Israel when the true causes are so clear to anyone who wishes to see them. And, sadly, when I wrote those chapters, I was writing about the hostages and the fact that they were still in Gaza unfathomably many months after their abduction. So I actually stopped writing the book in June of 2024, and the book was published October 2024. And I had really hoped that by the time my book was published, the hostages would be home and the war would be over, and it's really just tragic that 100 hostages remain in Gaza and that, 60,000 Israelis are still homeless in the north. So many people's lives have just been upended for over a year, and it doesn't really look like their lives will go back to normal anytime soon. Yeah,
and I think as you say, the book really captures that. I think it's clear. I do want to say, and I mentioned this to you before we started recording, I'll say this to the listener, that, you are a journalist, and it says clearly that you're a journalist, and that really comes through and shines through the book. Reading many history books, academic books, sometimes even great books are not very readable. Sometimes they're harder to read, I'll say. But this is clearly written by a journalist. It's very readable. It's easy to get through. It's quick to get through. Obviously, a lot of information, some of it very sad, as we've discussed here on the episode. I will point that out. But I found it to be an enjoyable read and a non-enjoyable topic, if that makes sense. Meaning, it's enjoyable to read it, while, of course, it's extremely sad. So hopefully making sense. And so I'll link to the book in the show's notes for those interested. You can check it out. And thank you, Yardena, for joining me to discuss the book.
Thank you so much, Nachi. It was really a pleasure.